Stay on time. Well, what we're going to be talking about today is obviously pen testing. Who in here actually buys or orders or coordinates pen tests for their company? Oh, well, that's good. All right, so my name's Martin Voss. I do penetration testing full time. I work at Trusted Sec. I also worked on the Backtrack and the Kali Linux project. I'm also one of the founders of the DerbyCon Security Conference. Did anyone go to DerbyCon?
No.
Did you have a good time?
Yeah. I can't remember.
I'm not a CISSP, so if that matters to you, sorry. And there's my Twitter handle. So, what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about penetration tests, vulnerability assessments, risk assessments. Basically, I'm going to talk about the difference between the different types of testing that we can do. There's a lot of misinformation in the industry about what type of testing is what, and so I'm going to try to clear some of that up. I'm not saying that I'm the best tester or I do the best testing or that my company does. What I'm going to talk about is some of the different facts so that you can draw your own conclusion based on the companies. One of the major problems these days is that a lot of the people that buy and order these types of tests don't actually fully understand them. A lot of times it's some dude from the risk department is in charge of penetration testing for the company, and what happens is they don't really understand what it is that they're buying, so they go back to the only metric that they do understand, which is price, and then testing is bought based on price, which doesn't go very well. So, a couple other buzzwords I got going on here. High impact vulnerabilities, we made that up. Cyber hygiene, security, maturity, risk appetite, and we'll touch on some thought leadership. All right, so most of the organizations where I go in today, this is what your security program looks like. A couple of places are getting a little bit more mature, and this does not mean that you're getting hacked all over the place or that you're doing a bad job or anything. What it means is that money is not being spent in the right place. There's too many people in charge. You know the old saying, too many chiefs, not enough Indians? I see that a whole lot in security organizations. All kinds of people have director titles and nobody is actually doing anything technical. That's where I like to talk about thought leadership, right? A lot of places everybody wants to be a thought leader, but nobody wants to be a thought executor. Anyway, and so this is what the programs look like in most places that I go. And we're still getting hacked, right? All over the place. Got Ashley Madison, the Hilton. These are all the 2015s. I could have done 18 more slides with all the ones that I came up with. This comes from privacyrights.org if anybody's interested. It's a really great website to check on data breaches, the types of breaches, where they happen. It's called privacyrights.org. And you can search by year, type of breach, type of company. You can look up your business vector. It's really cool. So, once all of this stuff happens, what do we get? We get the sales guy. And he comes into your organization, and he gets you on the phone, and he sits in front of you and says, you need a penetration test before you end up like Target. Right. So the problem with this is that when you talk about the different types of security testing that there are, you have risk assessments. That doesn't sound very exciting, does it? Auditors and paperwork and all that stuff. That sucks. That's not sexy. Nobody wants to buy that. Then you have a vulnerability assessment. Well, you have all the people like me on Twitter all day long making fun of people that do vulnerability assessments. So you don't want to get one of those because that can't be what you really want, right? So a penetration test, that sounds cool. That sounds like what we need. And this guy will sell it to you. And he doesn't care what you really, really need. So I'm going to talk about some of the terms that we're talking about and what they mean to me and basically what they mean to the organization that I work for. The first one is a penetration test. And so the definition that I came up with for this is a method of evaluating the security of a computer system or a network by simulating an attack from malicious outsiders. So a couple of myths about a penetration test that I want to bring up. The first myth is that it's going to find all of the vulnerabilities on your network. Not going to happen. That's not what it's for. What we're looking for with a penetration test is that we're finding the path or paths, depending on how much time we have, of least resistance in your organization. We are paid to think like attackers. We're not paid to do something really technical or really crazy or really serious unless we have to. Because if you have a really stupid vulnerability in your network, we're going to take advantage of it, and that's how we're going to get in, and then we're going to show it to you, and that's going to be the penetration test. You're going to say, well, that's really stupid. Why did I pay $50,000 for you to do that? And I'm going to say, well, that's really stupid that you had that issue, right? I mean, and so another myth about penetration testing is that it's really, really difficult, right? It's not a lot of times. A lot of times we're going to take, do a phishing attack or something like that. And so one of the things that happens a lot of times is that the scope in a penetration test is reduced. And when that happens, that's not really good, right? Because as an attacker, everything in your organization is in scope. So when you do a real penetration test, everything should be in scope in your organization. I'm talking about social engineering, physical entry, whatever we can do to get in. So the number of times, I don't see it as much in my current organization, but the place where I used to work, I'd say 80% of the clients that I went to were not ready for a penetration test, but that's what they bought. Because they wanted that because that's an industry buzzword and it's sexy and it sounds cool. So that brings us to the next type of testing, which is a vulnerability assessment. This is what most places need. If you do not have a very secure, mature security program in your organization, what you're really looking for is a vulnerability assessment. And this is where people like me, and I'll do this, I'm not against this. What's important here is that, I'm not snobby, I'll do any kind of testing that there is. What I'm more concerned about is that organizations get the right kind of testing that they need, because that's what's beneficial. So in a vulnerability assessment, we come in and we assess the entire network. You'll say, I got 5/16s, and we'll say, okay. And we'll use automated tools because it speeds up the process, right? I mean, you have to. And then we'll go back through all of those vulnerabilities. The benefit of having an actual consultant that knows what they're talking about do it is they're able to filter out all of the false positive. Anybody that knows that might have a vulnerability scanner in their organization knows that there's so many issues that a lot of times they can get drowned out, and if you don't know which ones actually have public exploits, which ones have remote code execution, which ones are a problem, if you don't have somebody that can tell you that, it just becomes a wealth of nonsense, and it gets pushed to the back burner, and nobody fixes anything. So obviously you would want to have a vulnerability assessment way before you have a penetration test, right? If it's up to me, I recommend people do this for a year or two before they even begin to think about real penetration testing. The problem in our community these days is that most companies, I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but most companies sell a vulnerability assessment and they call it a penetration test. I mean, and that's just the way that it is. And I'll tell you some really tips on how you can know. Another important part about penetration testing is not being whitelisted, right? We don't want to be whitelisted from any of your security defenses. You've paid, tens of thousands, maybe even millions of dollars for, what was that thing we just saw, FireEye or like whatever, right? You have all these things on your network. And I'm not against devices. Devices, can work in the right situation, but if I ask to be whitelisted from those devices, I'm not doing a real penetration test, right? Because, I might be looking at the vulnerabilities on the server, but I'm not looking at all the mitigating controls in place that allow me to get to that server. I've been in a lot of networks where they just had some systems that they could not patch. A perfect example is this place in California. They had some PBX systems, and they only ran on Windows 2003, and it had MS-0867. It had their whole phone network on it. They just couldn't afford to change it. So what they did was they took those boxes off the domain, they firewalled off port 445, they did all of this stuff to put those boxes way over here, so even if they were compromised, it was no big deal. So that's what we call mitigating controls. So if I would have asked to be whitelisted from all of those controls, I would have compromised them with the MS-0867, I would have rated it critical, and then everyone would have been upset, but it really wasn't, right? So that's a big difference between vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. So if you have a vendor come in and they immediately ask to be whitelisted and they start running automated scanners on day one, you're probably getting a vulnerability assessment, right? Do we use automated scanners? Absolutely, but I use mine on Friday morning just to make sure that I didn't miss anything to provide as much value as possible. But I do not ever pen test from the results of a scanner. Another type of testing is a risk assessment, right? We talked about this. It's boring, paperwork, auditors, all of that kind of stuff. However, assessing your risk is really important because a lot of places I go don't even know what they're protecting. They have no idea. You know, I'll go into a lot of places and I'll say, what are the top 3 things that make you money and what are you protecting? And a lot of times those 3 things will be totally different. And they won't even be able to tell me. So I actually encourage people to have this type of thing done first, right? Coming into an organization, mapping out what's important to you, mapping out what makes you money because that's what you're trying to protect, and then figuring out a plan to protect that stuff. Then you come in to do a vulnerability assessment. Then you come in to do a penetration test to test whether all your vendors are actually securing their products correctly, putting them in the right place and all of that type of stuff. The final type of testing that I want to talk about is testing driven by compliance. If this is what you're doing, I mean, I got really good news for you. Like most auditors will take, you know, as long as your report has about 400 pages and at least 100 IPs in it, they'll take it. So stop wasting your money on expensive vendors. You can hire anybody for testing for compliance, right? So if this is your primary motivation, you're probably going to lose every time. Now, that's not to say that compliance isn't a good baseline to get started, but if that's your primary motivation, I'm sorry for you. All right, so talked about all these different things and the different types of testing and where they're places. So what you might be wondering is, how do I really know that I need a pen test? You know, what type of testing do I need? And what I'm hoping to provide you guys with is the correct questions to be asking vendors when they come in. Am I trying to sell Trusted Sec? Not at all. There's plenty of vendors out there that do penetration testing. Obviously, we're the best, but there's all kinds of different ones that you can choose, right? And I want to be able to try to empower you with the correct questions to ask so that when the salespeople come in and try to sell you a test, you're driving the conversation rather than them putting fear into you to make sure that you don't end up like Target. This type of thing. Has anybody ever seen one of these? I mean, like, what does that even mean, right? It doesn't, there is no, there is no risk probability type of thing on a penetration test. It doesn't matter how many computers you have. It doesn't matter how much they cost. It doesn't, anything that's on your domain can be compromised, right? Anything can be compromised. So when you're looking at scope for a test, when people are like, well, I got 500 IPs on my network, but I can only I can only afford to test 100 of them based on, your pricing model or whatever. Like, that's not good. You need to find somebody that can test all 500 of them and focus on only the ones that are critical. That type of question. I know a lot of organizations charge by IP, and that ends up getting really costly. But if you think about it, I mean, if you have 500 IPs on your network, I'm only going to be really attacking 10 or 20 of them, right? But you want to be able to have the whole thing in scope if possible. So talking to a vendor about that type of thing can really be helpful. Sorry, I'm still trying to get over DerbyCon. The next thing is, what am I trying to protect? I touched on this a little bit, but most places I go have no idea what the primary thing is that makes their company money. A perfect example of this is I did a penetration test at an oil and gas company down in Texas, and I just assumed when I was doing the test, and I got in their database and it dumped all this information, and I was really proud, and I said, I got your customer list, I got all this stuff, and I thought that would be the most important thing to them, but it wasn't. Turns out that turns out that the most important thing to an oil and gas company is actually the CAD survey drawings of where they're drilling for oil. Had no idea. I would never know that, right? And they didn't even really realize that either. And so that stuff was all unprotected in a database somewhere, and helping them figure out that was the most important thing to their organization was really cool and was a cool thing to work on. And so one of the first questions I ever ask when I come in somewhere is, what are you trying to protect, right? Because a penetration test is supposed to have a goal. So when I come in, I'm I'm asking you, what are you trying to protect? What is our goal for the end of the penetration test? And so if you can't tell me that, that's a problem. And so that's the kind of thing that you need to know before you even do this type of testing. 9 times out of 10, we get in from an easy win. And when I talk about an easy win, I'm talking about something that should have been found by a low-level security analyst, should have been found by a vulnerability scanner, should have been found by somebody. Now, if you're a really small organization and you can't afford a vulnerability scanner, and I don't know why you wouldn't, they're pretty cheap, but then that's a different story. But if I go into a big place with, 10,000 computers and I find a really easy issue, that's a problem, and they've basically wasted their money because they're already paying somebody to do the job that I came in to do. So, talk about low-hanging fruit, right? High-impact vulnerabilities. And these are the things that should be found by a vulnerability scanner. Like this one, right? This vulnerability is so famous, we're making cakes for it on its birthday. I don't find it as much as I used to, but 2-3 years ago, I was still finding this all over the place. Totally ridiculous. This type of stuff. Default credentials, still find this everywhere. This is simple stuff that a vulnerability scanner would find. Here's my favorite. I think I've got into every organization in the past year with this. Tomcat. Anybody run into Tomcat? Yep. And then an oldie but a goodie. Cold Fusion. This thing has more issues than Java, I think. Anyway, and so I'm just highlighting all of these because these are the things that a vulnerability scanner can find. What's important about vulnerability scanners, though, is not just buying one and running it in your organization. Like I talked about, you actually have to have somebody behind it that can interpret, digest, and send out the results in an actionable format to each of the different groups that, they would relate to. We see this a lot, deployment misconfigurations. This particular one is LLM-NR poisoning, NetBIOS spoofing. Pretty much everybody still has this going on. Patching, still a huge issue in organizations, not keeping up with the patching cycle. Systems that aren't in the patching cycle. One of the main things that I see is in technology, there's so many mergers and acquisitions. People are buying up littler companies and stuff all the time, and what happens is they bring a company into the fold without running proper security testing on that company. Somebody doesn't get the memo to add these 100 computers to the patching cycle, and 2-3 months later, next thing you know, they're getting popped all over the place. I talked about this a little bit. Buy a vulnerability scanner. They're pretty cheap. I think Nessus costs like $1,200. I mean, it's not that, a year or whatever. It's not that expensive. But most importantly, hire somebody that knows how to run it. Hire somebody that can digest the results. And if you aren't able to hire somebody that can digest the results, you can have a company come in and do it. I mean, there's no harm in having a third-party company come in and do, monthly scans, quarterly scans. We have a little box that we send out, and you just stick it in your data center, and you could say, hey, can you run a vulnerability scan every month, and we'll just send you the results, in a actionable format, not the report out, not the report out of the scanner, but, our version of the report with the actual important things. There's nothing wrong with vulnerability scanning. It has its place. The biggest thing I see is a lot of companies are now scanning, but what they're not doing is the remediation and the retesting, right? Because if you don't retest, it's all good to run a scan, say, okay, we got these issues, we're going to send them over here to Billy Bob in the IT department, and if you're not going back and checking whether Billy Bob fixed those vulnerabilities, then there's no way to determine whether they were fixed, right? So scanning and rescanning of the same assets over to make sure that the remediation is actually being done. You can also do something I've seen work really well in organizations is sanctions and rewards, right? I'm more of a rewards kind of person, but you might be more of a sanction kind of person, I don't know. But I've seen programs that reward people for security testing work. Especially in phishing, right, where you have like Starbucks gift cards, right, or something, or every time you report a phishing email, you get a $10 Starbucks gift card, right? I mean, even if you spent $5,000 on Starbucks gift cards all year rewarding people, it would still be less expensive than one breach that you had to clean up. Not really that big of a deal. And then, of course, third-party testing. I know nowadays a lot of organizations have their own red teams, their own internal pen test teams, and all of that stuff, and they think that's fantastic. And it is, and I believe every organization should have their own internal testers. However, I still think you should have third-party testers come test behind them that have no stake in the company whatsoever. Because if you look at it from my perspective, say I work at, we'll pick on somebody local, Humana, and my job is to do vulnerability scanning, but my job is also to fix the vulnerability scanning issues because I'm a security analyst, right? I'm not just one job. So my job is to scan and to fix. Well, that means the more issues I find, the more work I got to do, right? So that's not really that awesome. So looking at it from that perspective, I'm probably not going to find as many issues when I'm vulnerability scanning because I know I got to fix them. So at the very least, you know, breaking out those people's workloads internally. But I'm still a big advocate. I'm a big advocate of internal testing teams, but third-party testing on top of it. This is one of my favorite terms because it's ridiculous, but it's actually a little bit legit, right? And so I used to make fun of risk appetite a whole lot until I got into some really big organizations. I started learning more about the business side of things. I used to be purely technical penetration testing, 1 or a 0. It was either broke or it was, it was broke or it was good, and I didn't realize a lot about budgets and like being able to only fix certain stuff and having to prioritize which issues were the biggest risks to the company. And so over the past few years learning about a lot about that stuff, I've determined that even though I still think this phrase is ridiculous, it does exist, right? A lot of times you have to prioritize what the risk is. And this is one of the reasons why you would do all of this type of testing. You would have a risk consultant come in and help you determine, what was the most risky. But even then, the thing about risk is that they come in and tell you what area of your company might have the most risk. However, unless you have a penetration test to actually prove it, then you're just working on, what somebody says. So that's where this type of testing goes hand in hand. So having, a risk person come in and say, all right, here's what we have to make money. This is what I see the riskiest parts of your organization are. And then not sharing any of that information with the penetration tester, having them come in and see what they go after and see if that stuff matches up. So monitoring. Monitoring is super, super important, and a lot of the presentations that I've seen here and a couple other places are all centered around you need this device because you need to log everything. And then what happens is that nobody can actually dissect that information, right? If your organization is big enough and you're like, log everything, and then it all comes into the SIM, and then you got some poor kid sitting there all night long in the SOC, drinking Red Bull, trying to correlate all of these events. Well, that's great, but you're going to miss something that way. So what we like to do, and I had another slide, but what we like to do on a penetration test, and what you should be making your vendors do, is having them come in and work with your monitoring teams. So what I see a lot of times, I come in, I go bam, 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 and I compromise this, that, and the other, and then I type up a report, and then I say, would you like me? So I keep detailed logs of everything, and your pen test vendor should be able to provide that to the second of when they did anything. And then we should be able to go back with the blue team and say, okay, at 9:55 I did X, Y, and Z. What did you see? And then they'll say, well, we didn't see anything because we have 82 feeds coming in from 150 servers, and then you can say, well, this is what you should have been looking for, and they can go back and create an event for that particular thing. And so when I go in to do testing, that's more of a success for me than getting domain admin or credentials or whatever. If I walk out of there with 5 new events for that company that they should be looking for a real world attack, I really feel good about that. I feel like I made a difference. And so the amount of companies that actually ask me to do that are very, very slim. But so while you should be monitoring, getting your monitoring to actually only actionable, things is really, really difficult. Anyone that knows me knows that passwords are my favorite thing. I love to, I do it as a hobby. I love to break passwords. There's actually a big contest at DEF CON every year. We compete in with my team Hashcat. And so the thing about passwords is that I honestly don't even understand why we're still using them. I mean, it's great for me, but password policies in organizations are still inadequate. So if you do not have a single sign-on or some type of two-factor solution, you don't have any choice but to make your passwords really long. It still really surprises me when I go into places and they have the Windows default 8 characters with complexity or whatever turned on. I don't know if anybody follows GPU processing, but we can, with the home GPU servers that we have these days, we can go through the entire 8-character key space in about 4 hours for an NTLM password. So that means that basically passwords are just not safe. Size does matter. The longer it is, the harder it is to break. I mean, obviously we want them to be complex with phrases and all of that type of stuff, if possible, but sheer size does matter because it takes longer to get through them. Another thing I see happen a lot is companies deploy a two-factor solution on one part of their computers, but not the other part. I was just at a place recently where they had two-factor on every single desktop, all the way across the organization for remote desktop, which would have been awesome, except for they didn't have it on port 445. So you could just log right in with PSExec and there was no problem at all. You were all set. But so sometimes when you're deploying a solution like that, you don't think about that kind of thing because normally admins these days use PowerShell or RDP or whatever. No one's really using PSExec over port 445 anymore, so it gets forgotten. So one of the reasons why having a penetration test can bring out those type of things. Another point of testing is to actually know your adversaries, right? I mean, every presentation you go to is China, 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 right? China's trying to get you or whatever. But there's all kinds of people that could be, while I do think China's probably trying to get us, there's a lot more people that are a lot more dangerous. The person that I'm afraid of is the kid that's sitting in his mom's basement that doesn't have a job and has some supercomputer and doesn't have anything better to do than just to compromise organizations and cause mischief. Those are the people that scare me a little bit more than China. So helping to know your adversaries is and I'll, a lot of times, I'll go in companies and I'll say, hey, I just don't think you're that big of a target, right? I mean, for this type of thing. They'll have, they're like, we're going to block the whole Pacific Rim. And and you're like, what? And they're like, well, they told me, when I bought this product that China was trying to get me. And I'm like, you make 2x4s. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense, right? So having some people in there to help you know your adversaries can be really, really beneficial in a pen test situation. Here's the biggest thing that I ever talk about when I go into an organization. This is the simplest thing that you can do to protect yourself. Network segmentation. You probably already have all of the stuff in place to do this. And there's a big difference between an actual VLAN an actual, like a security zone VLAN, right? Just because you have VLANs does not mean you have network segmentation. What I mean is firewall rules so you can't get from A to Z or, B to F or whatever. So I'm talking about isolating your servers, your corporate resources. Read-only domain controllers are really popular right now, that type of stuff. And so basically where I'm going with this is when I break into your organization and I sit down at somebody's workstation and I plug in, there's no reason why I should be able to get to the entire server network. And there's no reason why I should be able to get to the VoIP network. That should be VLAN'd off. There's stuff like that is what really stops us on penetration tests when we're attacking. If you really so what happens is everybody just wants it all to work, right? We spend all this money on the exterior and we don't worry about the interior because we want everything to work. But when I come in a place and I plug into the network, if we were to get really granular and look at each single user, I bet they use Active Directory and 1 or 2, maybe 3 internal applications all day for their job. And that's probably it. So why would they need access to anything else in the entire environment? And so this is stuff that is really simple to fix, and you probably already have the architecture in place to do it. And so that way, when you have a test like one of ours and you say, hey, break into our organization and see where you can get to, then I'm not just sitting down at somebody's desk and getting domain admin in 10 minutes because I can't get there, right? And then you spend more money on securing the data center and that type of stuff. Another thing that I think is really, really important is hire a pen tester. There's all kinds of people like me that have spent 5, 10 years on the road and no longer want to travel and are sick of it and would like nothing more than to work at an organization like yours and have a desk job and come in every day. The problem is the salaries aren't competitive, right? Traveling consultants with high expertise and knowledge of penetration testing make a lot of money, unfortunately. So when they go to work somewhere, you know, local or whatever, they don't get a competitive salary and then they won't take it. But I cannot stress the benefits of having an ex-pen tester on staff, right? Because A, they can help you get third-party pen tests. B, they can do a lot of the work themselves. C, they can work really closely with your blue team. And part of that goes with this, you know, making your blue team sexy, right? Like securing the organization is not that fun of a job, right? And so you'll hear it a lot, like I only have to find one way in, your blue team has to protect thousands of ways in. But if you can get those people together and make it a little bit more fun, and so people that used to be penetration testers like to do blue team stuff because I already know it's easy for me, I already know what I'm looking for, right? So for example, if I was to stop consulting and I wanted to work somewhere, I would want to be the head of somebody's blue team, right? Because I would be able to help them do all of that. But the problem is that there's a lot of things that just don't line up. And the one thing that I've seen mostly is salaries, right? Salaries don't line up. The people on the blue team just don't make as much money on the people as the red team. It's not as fun. They don't get to do as much cool stuff. So figuring out a way to make your blue team a whole lot more sexy, bring in some red team people, that will get you a purple team. A lot of people talked about the purple team last year. I don't know who actually made it up, but it is a really good concept, right? I mean, you would want to have attackers on your defense team, and we like to have defense people on our attacking team because if you've deployed all the latest defenses, you can tell us how to get around them. So another big thing, research your vendor. Just because they threw the biggest, best black hat party does not mean they actually know what they're doing. That just means that they wasted more money on their party. I see this a whole lot, is that vendors are chosen for, you know, because got tickets to a party or, you know, they brought the most free booze or whatever. And not that going to parties is bad, but it's not the way to pick your vendors. So doing some research on your vendors, seeing what type of testing they're doing. What I like to tell people is ask for the names of the people on the pen test team and see how many free and open source projects they're involved in, because that shows passion about security. If you work 9 to 5 all day and then you stay up all night to work on a distribution like Backtrack or Kali or something, building packages and all of that kind of stuff, that means that that person is actually, you know, dedicated to that organization. And then you ask for that person. Another big thing is the bait and switch, right? Where you call a place and they got like one guy that everybody's heard of, and then they got like 10 junior testers. And you're doing the scoping and the interviewing. You got the one guy on and he's talking about all this fancy stuff that he's going to do and 0 days and APTs and all of that kind of stuff. And then you actually buy the pen test and then 2 people you've never heard of show up, you know. And that doesn't mean name recognition. I don't mean industry rock stars or anything like that. I just mean that the person should have some work out there of some kind, right? It might be a GitHub account, it might be, you know, whatever, but to show that they're passionate about security, because it's a hard job. I mean, we travel all over the place, long hours, and so it takes a special kind of person to do it. So I'll beware of anyone that calls himself a thought leader. I mean, like, it's such a, you know, I found this great quote on the internet or whatever that someone cannot give themselves the thought leader title. If you click through LinkedIn and look how many people call themselves a thought leader, it's absolutely astounding. I mean, what does that even mean? Like, I mean, I just don't, for me, like, it doesn't make any sense. I want people that execute actions, you know. I don't care about what they think about, because most of the people I know that call themselves a thought leader have never been technical and have never been, you know, doing pen tests or doing security testing or anything like that. You know, they graduated from Harvard and then they got a CSO position and now they're a thought leader and they don't know what they're talking about. If it says that on your LinkedIn, I'm sorry. Once again, you can't protect what you don't know about, right? Stuff slips through the cracks. Mergers and acquisitions, all of that kind of stuff. Once again, penetration testing can really help you figure out what you need to be protecting against. So all of this kind of sums up for me as the death of traditional penetration testing, right? Normally in the past, we've had people come in and they run some scanners, they find some SSL vulnerabilities and that type of stuff. Every now and then they'll find a 0-day. That type of testing is sort of on its way out, right? And the reason is because only the really highly specialized stuff is going to kind of shine out at the end. You know, the traditional style of penetration testing will always be good enough to get your PCI compliance or whatever, but if we're really trying to secure our organizations, it's not going to be good enough. One of the things that's, you know, gotten a lot of press lately is the rise of managed bug bounties, right? And this is one of the reasons why I think penetration testing is on its way out, because the bug bounty program, you can advertise basically to have your stuff compromised by security researchers. And so I think a lot of penetration testers are going into the research side of things for the bug bounty programs, right? Because they can find one bug bounty, you know, in a 6-month period and get just as big a payout as they can from working all year for a consulting company. And so in some cases, this type of testing might make more sense for your organization. Like, for example, in the case of United and their web application, right? They could have had a consulting company come in and do all this testing on their web application and paid $50,000 or $100,000 or whatever for the testing. Or they could just get out there on the internet and be like, hey, anybody that can find an issue in this application will pay you $100,000, right? The same amount of money was spent, but you actually crowdsourced to the entire internet to actually find that vulnerability, right? So if you have one specific thing that you're looking for an issue in, this whole bug bounty thing might make sense. I'm not trying to get myself out of a job or anything, but it can make sense, right? Now, you know, your organization has to be pretty mature to open yourself up to the internet and be like, come get us. But that's you know, I think that type of testing is gonna be a lot more popular in the next 5 to 10 years. So when does pen testing still make sense? Like I talked about, if you have a goal, that's when penetration testing makes sense, right? This is my goal. Show me how many ways you can get there. Mergers and acquisitions, actually I already talked about all this stuff, but mergers and acquisitions, you buy a company, go in and do a pen test, do some vulnerability scanning, figure out what you're inheriting, right? Is it, you know, is it great or is it a giant, well, whatever. Anyway, and product launch. We do a lot of product launch type stuff. Obviously you should have security built into the life cycle of the product, but there's no reason why you can't have a third party come in and do some testing on that product. We actually do a lot of that. And I actually really like doing it. I really like doing sort of black box stuff that I don't know anything about. And I love it when they send me some random product I've never even heard of and just say, you know, figure out if you can break this. Another really good resource for figuring out whether you're actually getting a real penetration test is the P-test, the Penetration Testing Execution Standard. There's a whole lot of security consultants that got together about 5 years ago and created this sort of a wiki type thing, but it actually goes through all of the different steps of a penetration test. Unfortunately, I'm not going to talk about it a lot because you could talk all day about it, but I really encourage anyone that does security testing to go take a look at it. It tells you basically everything you should be asking, what the vendor should be asking. I'm actually surprised that it hasn't been a lot more widely adopted than it has been, but we utilize this a lot at Trusted Sec. We follow this pretty closely, and it works really well. It works really well for, after a test is done and you get a report and you're on the, you're on the client side, reading through that and seeing if you actually got what you paid for is really important. That's my next slide. Make sure you get what you paid for. I talked about this a little bit already, the disconnect. There's always a big disconnect between the actual testing and the blue team. So a lot of times I don't even feel like my information gets past the, the CSO or whoever I did the test for. So bringing those two teams together and having them work together during the penetration tests can really improve the security of your organization. So what should I get out of a penetration test, right? So understanding the risks and threats that you can feed back into how you design and develop networks and applications. The goal of the pen test is not to make you patch your systems. I mean, obviously you want to do that afterwards, but that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is help you see the flaw in how those systems were deployed unpatched in the first place, or how they made it through, a patching cycle in the first place. So that's what we're trying to do, is to help you in the long term. Going back to Tomcat, the reason that I find Tomcat and everybody, so for anybody that doesn't know, in Tomcat, when you deploy it, the Tomcat user runs as local admin on the system. So if you have the default credentials on Tomcat, you're already local admin on a Windows system, which, as you know, is the beginning of the end for any network because Windows is so great. The problem is that what happens is you get developers. So the production Tomcats are always deployed properly, but you get developers that don't understand security, and so they spin up these default versions of Tomcat and they go to build their applications on them, and they never secure the actual Tomcat itself. But they joined it to the domain because they need their application to work. It's got to access XYZ database, and they're under all these tight timelines, and they don't have SDLC built into the life cycle of their program. And then what happens is you have all these vulnerable Tomcat servers on the system. So in that particular situation, I would come in and help figure out, okay, how are we going to put our developers all the way over here in left field, or how are we going to train them to deploy these systems properly? Understanding the process of attack for your company. Just because you work there and you know what the most important thing is in your company does not mean that you know how it will be attacked, right? You have no idea really. And so that's where we come in, is coming in and helping determine, you go to work every day, it's a 9-to-5 job, you come in and you work at your desk, like you're not thinking about camera placement and can I tailgate in here and all of this kind of stuff, right? That's the kind of stuff that we come in and look at. And so that shows what a motivated attacker can do with the weaknesses. We're not just showing the weakness. I mean, that any vulnerabilities scanner can do that. What we're showing is what we can do with those weaknesses. What kind of impact can we do to the organization? What can we do to, affect your ability to make money and that type of stuff. And then, of course, smart people can find issues you never even thought about on your blue team. That's all I have. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.